Hey team, welcome back to Rosspec. We've been taking the EL out to Queensland Raceway and we've slowly been getting quicker and quicker, but it hasn't come without its problems. We've had some spluttering issues, so now it's time to sort that out. We're going to do some upgrades on the fuel system. But why stop there? How about we chuck in a couple more parts to see if we can get just that little bit quicker. All right, let's get into it. So the plan is add a surge tank. I've had this surge tank for like 10 years now. We originally used it with my XD when we put the AU XR8 engine in there. When we first put it in, well, considering that we went from a 250 crossflow to a running and driving AU XR8 engine in essentially 2 weeks, the bit of a spaghetti that I had here, yeah, it was just necessary rather than pretty. So when the old boy got it back on the road, he did something different and he moved the fuel pump to inside the tank, so it didn't need the surge tank anymore. We're going to recycle this, but to use a surge tank, I need a lift pump. So I got one of those too, a brand new lift pump. But to go to this sort of effort, I've always wanted to do a full fuel system. So why not add 20 litre fuel cell? But to make that 20 litre fuel cell work, I also need a new fuel pump. So that's a Raceworks, old 044 style one, which should be supply plenty of fuel for this engine. But then to make all this work, I need a box full of fittings and hose. So got a lot to do here, let's get into it. I started by removing the wide body guard. The Temu quick mount had failed on this side too, so I had to remove some race tape. Then I undid the screws and got it out of the way. Now I could siphon some of the fuel I had in the tank to make it easier to remove later. There was still the 20 litres that I put in it at the track last time, and some more. At this stage I'm leaving it in, so if anything goes wrong I can still drive the car around. The fuel cell has this little sump in the bottom, and it's also got a baffle, like a foam baffle on the inside. So that should stop the fuel from moving around. The baffle should stop the fuel from moving around inside the tank, while this sump will keep more fuel down the bottom. But what that means is that I can't flat mount it straight onto the floor. So what I've got is some of this box section that I'm going to make some standoffs for it. After some measuring, I cut the standoffs to length. After drilling a pilot hole, drilled a larger hole. Then installed some nutserts. I bolted the standoffs to the tank, and then it was time to start figuring out where stuff would go in the boot. So this is my drawing for the fuel system that I've come up with. Big thank you to Motorsport Accessories in Brendale for putting up with me for about an hour. I went there with the drawing, but I didn't actually have any sizes of the fittings that I needed. So we slowly built the fittings from the tank all the way through back to the car. So the other thing, we went through and we ticked them all as we got them, and then we ticked them all as we put them through the counter. So hopefully everything that I need is in the box. And in the box it was. But where was I going to put everything? I originally wanted to mount the tank on the passenger side, but it fit better in the spare tyre well. With that sorted, I laid out the other major components. Now it was time to hard mount the fuel cell. I made a template of the nutserts I had mounted to the bottom, then drilled the holes and mounted it up. Okay, the fuel cell is in its forever home for now. The only reason I'll move it is if I realise that it's in the wrong place and I need to move it for something. So I've got some brackets for the lift pump to hold it up off the floor, and I've lined the 90 so that I'll get pretty much a straight run to the fuel supply from the bottom of the tank. I want to minimise the amount of hose that I'm going to use. So I need to mount that and then start moving over this way. With the lift pump hard mounted too, I could start running hoses. To get the right length, I installed a fitting on one end, marked the length where it needed to go, cut the hose, then installed the fitting on the other end. Then I could mount it into place. And piece by piece I made my way from the tank, through the lift pump, the surge tank, the fuel pump, and back again. And there it is, all the fittings, all snug up and tight. Got all the hoses going where they're going. Now I haven't put the hose on the vent yet because I've run out of hose, so I'll need to do that later. That's no big deal. It still looks a bit like spaghetti, doesn't it? Well, that's the best I could lay it out in this boot and still use the factory fuel lines. Now it's time to run some electrical. Okay, so I've run a dedicated power line from the battery terminal through to a relay, a fuse and a switch for the lift pump inside the car so I can turn it on and off, exclusive of the key. Cable down through the side, all the way under the floor, follow the loom up into the boot. Now all that's left to do is put some fuel in it and see if we've got any leaks. After putting some fuel in the tank, I checked for any basic leaks. Then activated the lift pump and checked for leaks again. Finally, I plugged in the fuel pump and checked for any final possible leaks. With that all good, there's only one thing to do: fire her up. Success! Now time to move on to some front upgrades. So with the factory setup, I can only get 2 degrees of camber out of the front. So I was searching on Marketplace and I found a guy selling this fab ass lower control arm. Now, in the process of organising an upper control arm, they told me that the design that I'd actually bought was the old design. So what they did was they took my lower control arms in and they remanufactured them and put the new style bushing. So originally there was for the shock mount, there was a tube on the top, but now it's actually got the bushing in there. At the same time, I got him to lengthen it 30 millimeters so I don't have to use the spacer anymore. Now, when you have a look at it, it's got different style ball joints than what an E-Series would have. That's because you can use an AU upright or BABF upright and then use later model brakes. Winning, winning. Now everything in the front suspension had to come out. I started by removing the caliper and hanging it out of the way. Then undid the sway bar, the tie rod, loosened the top shock bolts and removed the bottom bolt. Then removed the nut on the front of the caster arm and the inner bolt on the lower control arm. To give myself more room, I removed the airbox so I could unbolt the upper control arm. Then it was time to muscle out the whole front corner. I did notice before I put them in that the bottom of the shock, when it loaded height, would just touch the plates that hold the new caster rod. So before it went in, I marked the location and folded down a little to make sure that there was clearance between the two. Okay, so some of you might have already figured it out, but I'm not putting the original shock back in. I'm going with the coilover. So this is going to give me some adjustable height and some damping adjustment. And I meant to take a measurement of how high the car sat before I started pulling it apart, but I forgot. So probably gonna have to go up and down a couple of times to figure out the right height. Then it was time to install the new shock, the lower control arm, the caster rod, and the upper control arm. All right, so I got the upper and lower control arm in, and the caster rod in, and I was about to put the tie rod in. So I've got these little drop links that are supposed to go on the end of the steering column because apparently this kit can cause bump steer if you don't use these. Now, when I bought it, the guy gave me a steering column as well. At the time I didn't appreciate it, but it's got a little tab on the back to locate it, and these slots in the factory slot ones aren't big enough to take this here. And so this one, whoop, see it's got the bigger slots cut into it. So it looks like I'm gonna have to change the whole steering column too. Now that's a pain. That is going to add to my time to do all this. So what I think I'm going to do is finish up this side, do the other side, and then I'll do the steering column all at once, both left and right together. Now it's time to offer up the upright. And fit a wheel to check the ride height. After going up and down a couple of times, finally settled on a position to lock it in.
That's good. That's all right.
After removing the driver's side suspension, the power steering hoses, and the steering rod, I removed the steering rack. I've got the steering, this is the steering rack that come out, and this is the steering rack that's got to go in. I got it on the bench and I was about to swap it over as fast as I could, and then I realised the actual spline on these are different. So the EL has this coarse thread and the EF must be has a fine one. So my steering shaft wasn't going to work, but so as you can see in there it's got a coarse thread. But luckily the car that I should be building, it is an EF, and so I've had to pinch the steering rod out of that so I can get this all to work. Wish me luck, I'm going to put it back together. I installed the new steering rack and installed the EF steering rod. Now I installed the drop links and the tie rod. Now it's time to do something with the brakes. I've cleaned the hub up a little bit because I'm going to put a new disc on there. But what disc am I going to put on there? I'm going to go with, I was so happy with how the Bendix pads worked in the factory E-Series caliper. It blew me away how well the brakes actually worked. I was expecting them to just like blow out in the first track session, but they just kept going and going. They did those 3 sessions and you know, they still had plenty of life left on them. So I'm going to give the old Bendix Ultimate brake disc a go with another set of Bendix Ultimate pads, but this time in a 2-piston caliper. So this is a bit of a, this is actually an FG caliper. So the dog bone is from my factory GS brakes, but because they've just been sitting around for 10 years plus, the calipers themselves are seized. But luckily these calipers came with the Barra motor that I've bought for Faith. So they're not seized, but they would go with the smaller disc, the 298. So this is the 322mm disc with a FGGS dog bone so that it can go up to the 322mm. Then I've got the FGX caliper, and then I'm running it back to front, left to right, so that the bleed nipple sits up in the right direction. All right, let's start chucking some pieces on. After a clean up with some brake clean, I fit the new disc and held it in with a couple of nuts. Put the new pads in the caliper, then bolted it to the upright. Last but not least, remove the old caliper and brake hose. Remove the factory hose from the FGX caliper and install the new AU to BF length braided hose. And finally check the hose movement during rotation. Okay team, that's it. One side's done. It looks sick. You reckon there's going to be quantifiable time saved out on the track? Only time will tell. So what I've got left to do is obviously the other side. I've got to bleed the brakes, I've got to bleed the power steering, and I need to do a wheel alignment and reconnect the brake ducts and put the airbox back in. But that's it. What do you reckon? Is she going to go faster? Don't forget to like, subscribe if you want to find out. And remember, there's more to going fast than going fast. I'll catch you next time.